Okay, this is the last of our lectures. I appreciate you helping out to make this work in this difficult time, and hopefully we won't have to do this again. So today we're talking about sound mass, and I mentioned to you in the last lecture about pointillism that sound mass really comes out of pointillism. This is especially evident in a piece I asked you to listen to for this, on the worksheet 4.6, the Xenakis Pithoprakta, which is a piece that is both kind of pointillist in that the sounds, there's a lot of point-like sounds, but there's so many of them that they start to produce the effect of a sound mass. Or, in other words, a cloud of sounds where the human observer, most of us anyway, stop paying attention to or being able to perceive individual events or melodies, etc., and you start to hear much larger scale chunks of sound. That's basically all that sound mass is, and it has many manifestations. On worksheet 4.6 I include 3 composers who I think identify their music as being sound mass music. One of them is Penderecki, a Polish composer who just died a week ago or so. Very important, influential, interesting composer. His music is sort of the classic sound mass music, he built his sound masses out of just long tone clusters and layers of these clusters, but also of layers of sometimes indeterminate noises, instrumental noises, but so many of them, for instance, in the Threnody that I included, and also in the first string quartet, he instructs the string players to sort of independently make certain types of noises and sounds with their instruments, where there are enough things going on that you don't hear these individual sounds, and it creates a mass. Now we can think of sound mass in nature. Some of our favorite experiences in nature, sonic experiences, are of kind of sound masses. The sound of a waterfall or a bonfire. These are sounds where there's so many different sounds happening that they meld into an overall texture. We also think of there are mentions of sound masses in the scriptures. The voice of God or of Jesus Christ is described as the sound of the rushing of mighty waters. So this is a very, sound mass gets us into this very important aesthetic and spiritual property of the sublime being an experience that overwhelms and the listener or the observer, and makes that observer feel a sense of something larger than themselves, or even this sense of being de-subjectified, to being turned into, felt to be overwhelmed and subsumed into something larger, which is both frightening and desirable, I think. I think the sublime is a very important, again, experience. It's described in the scriptures. It's something that people seek out for sure. Whenever someone wants to, you go surfing or you rock climbing, or just going to look at a waterfall or look at the ocean. These are all that experience of being kind of overwhelmed by the bigness and the power of the universe, or something larger than ourselves. That, I think, is this idea of the sound mass. Now, initially, especially when we're listening to these pieces on recordings, we're not getting the real effect of a large ensemble of musicians creating this big sound and how powerful that is. So keep that in mind. I remember I had a student who, this is when I taught at Oregon State, and I had my students listen to a Xenakis piece that was quite loud and dissonant, and sound massy. And this one student came up to me afterwards and just was like, why did you force us to listen to this awful stuff? And it just overwhelmed my ears and blah blah blah. And he was really asking, why would anybody want to listen to this? And then I happened to know that he was a heavy metal advocate or fan, or actually performed this genre. And I said, well, why do you like to listen to super loud, overwhelming wall of sound metal, where you kind of have these guitars, using distortion that sort of widens the basically sound mass music. And he just sort of, it was a very fun moment, because he realized, oh yeah, I listen to music that other people consider to be kind of noise, and it is kind of noise to a certain extent, in as much as we think of sound that's highly focused in terms of pitch as being music or tone or pitch, and then on the other end of the extreme, sound or music that involves a lot of inharmonicity as being noise. Well, we all have our noise tastes. But at any rate, so we've got Penderecki, classic sound mass music, at least his first mature period. He kind of moved on to other things in his more recent music. Then I mentioned Xenakis. Xenakis is, a lot of Xenakis' music, especially earlier music, I would classify as sound mass, but particularly this Pithoprakta, which again I mentioned as this transition from pointillism, or sort of liminal piece of pointillism and sound mass made out of points. Xenakis is interesting in that he had he was by trade an architect, but he was very interested in mathematics, and particularly the branch of mathematics involving statistics and probabilities. And of course, when he first started composing, we talked about indeterminacy and its relationship in music, its relationship to math and science. But again, the operations of probabilities and statistics in our understanding of lots of physical phenomena, subatomic particles. Again, I don't want to get myself into too much trouble talking about over my head about physics, but this micro world where we can't directly observe what the tiniest particles are doing or where they are, but we can come up with statistical means to account for them and for multiples of them. So, and I had that quote of Xenakis where he talks about how the history of music, at least the recent history of music when he was writing this, led inexorably to sound mass. And he was talking about how with the sort of highly polyphonic music of the serialists, I think he's talking mainly about Schoenberg and Berg, and the serialist pieces of Boulez and Stockhausen and others, a listener, even an educated listener, started to not be able to follow all these multiple lines in a polyphonic texture, and that instead what one heard was a mass, just a texture made up of these supposedly independent lines. And one could say, okay, well, this is unsuccessful polyphony, or one could say, wow, we've jumped to a new type of texture. It's sound mass. We're not meant to hear individual lines or a complex of independent lines. We're now starting to just hear a block, a noise, an evolving block or noise. So let's see. So that's Xenakis. But Xenakis' particular technical means was these mathematical means, which is not really my area of expertise, but he wrote almost all of his music using kind of higher end math, mostly statistics and stochastic methods, probabilities. So it's kind of cool though, because Xenakis was really saying, okay, here's the outcome I want. Here's the sonic shape that I want, and it's too complex for me to compose by ear, one note at a time. It's a shape, and it's a shape that doesn't depend on every single note being perfect or in a particular place. It'll work within certain thresholds. So he creates these, sort of formulas or algorithms to generate notes and rhythms that will lead to this outcome. Now, some might say that's not totally different from, 12-tone serialism. I think it is. So that's Xenakis' music. I will put maybe one or two other examples of Xenakis' music below this video so you can check them out. Then I've included, I've talked about Ligety a little bit. His music in some ways is the most approachable, I think probably the most popular of these three composers. Ligety is kind of fun because he actually labeled his own musical techniques, and he had a few of them that he used and that he associated with specific pieces. And one of the techniques he called micropolyphony. And this is pretty straightforward. It's the idea of, leaning into what Xenakis was describing, but Ligety didn't use serialism. Micropolyphony is essentially the layering of many voiced canons. So many voices that the sense of the actual melodic shape itself being repeated or canonized is lost, and instead we get an interesting sort of woven texture. Again, he, I think, even used that metaphor, describing where you have a woven sweater or a carpet or something, and that has a repeating pattern or an evolving pattern, and you don't actually see the pattern, you see more of a texture. So that's Ligety's means to arrive at sound masses, micropolyphony. Also, I included Lux Aeterna, also in Atmospheres, probably his most famous piece, and the Requiem, and a few others. Now, some of these pieces, I believe the Penderecki and Ligety, a couple of pieces by Ligety, are actually used in the score of 2001 Space Odyssey, the great Stanley Kubrick film. I can't remember if I already mentioned that, but anyway. Okay, so those are the three kind of classic sound mass composers. Now, I've added a couple of others. So I would like you to listen. There's a piece by Jacinto Scelsi, Scelsi, below Uaxuctum. I don't know if I'm saying this right, but really beautiful, interesting orchestral piece. Scelsi, very interesting composer, probably one of the most eccentric composers I can think of. Italian composer who died, I think was born in the teens, died in the late 80s. He was a sort of self-described mystic, had kind of a pan spiritual approach or belief system, I guess, and drew from different religious traditions as the genesis of his pieces. Anyway, interesting biography. but almost all of his mature pieces. He had a nervous breakdown when he was, I can't remember how old, maybe in his 30s. And then his music before that was kind of, I guess, neoclassical in nature. And then after this nervous breakdown, and he started to sort of rebuild his life, he used music as therapy, and he started writing a very different kind of music that was based initially on single tones and radiating out from single tones. Then his music gradually began to become more complex, but always it was this idea of texture and of masses. And so Jacinto Scelsi, listen to some of that piece to get some idea, and it's got the score. Then I've included a couple of pieces from outside the Euro-American classical tradition. One of them is John Coltrane's album Ascension, and this is a really good and canonic example of free jazz. And what you'll find is that this is quite a large ensemble, mostly playing free improvisation simultaneously, and the effect is of a gradually evolving sound mass that sometimes thins out to individual performers, but even the sounds that these performers are making can tend to be sound masses in themselves, really wide clusters of activity within an instrument that creates, rather than a sense of a melody, creates more a sense of a mass, or sort of a buzzing mass. And then I've included the first movement from Glenn Branca's Symphony No. 3. Glenn Branca is a composer coming out, I think, out of the rock genre, and coming out of, he was in the circle of and played with the members of Sonic Youth, and they played on his pieces. And, this movement in New York in the early 80s called No Wave, not New Wave, No Wave. That's a whole topic in itself, but a kind of music that, I think it was the first rock music that sort of got rid of the blues origins of rock. It actually cleansed rock of its roots, basically, and said, okay, rock is drums, bass, and guitar, and then I think eighth notes. Da, 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 da. That's kind of where rock and roll comes from. Both the piano-based and guitar-based origin of rock is the eighth note, which in turn comes from boogie woogie. So there's sort of roots, but again, this isn't a class on no wave music. But anyway, so listen to these, the Glenn Branca Symphony No. 3. The basic concept of Glenn Branca's symphonies is to have multiples of electric guitars playing mostly open strings, but the strings have been carefully tuned to sort of remote partials in the harmonic series. But again, the effect is of sound mass. Okay? Now that leads us, actually, interesting, to the other three composers that I didn't talk about yet on Worksheet 4.6. And these are Grisey, Murail, and Tenney. These are three composers that we would classify as spectralists. And in other years, I've had a whole unit or a day on spectral music, or spectral composition. And this is a particular movement originated in one sense, the term spectral music originates in Paris in the early 70s. These two students of Messiaen's, Grisey and Murail. And we don't have a ton of time to talk about this music, but the basic concepts of spectral music are to use the harmonic series very directly as an inspiration for sonority, which is not a new thing, but specifically going into higher partials that are definitely not tempered, don't sound tempered. And the other aspect of it, again, this is very brief, is the use of analog synthesis techniques in the composition and performance of music for acoustic non-electronic instruments. So simulating ring modulation and filter sweeps and stuff like that in the realm of non-electronic music. So I think, but again, this is in the context of a textural strategy that is sound mass in nature. And I'm going to try to get rid of this little beam of light that's driving me nuts here. Gotta love these vertical blinds. Whose idea they were. Anyway, I don't know if that's any better, but okay. So, and you know, this is music that's coming out of Europe immediately after this sort of era of sound mass. You know, this is early 70s. The era of sound mass was kind of the 60s. So, Grisey, Murail, Spectralis. Then I've included James Tenney, who I believe, you know, some have been calling him an American spectralist, and have been pointing out that there was spectral music in the United States before this movement started in France. Of course, and there's also a scene in Romania, and there, you know, of course, these methods or these techniques, this paradigm has gone all over the place. But American spectralism, if we want to call it that, is I think probably more tied to minimalism than to sound mass, and that's in evidence here. The spectral canon for a tuned player piano. And also I had you listen to another piece of Tenney's, but lots of Tenney's music, I think, it's not as dissonant, but I would class it as sound mass music that's really about evolving textures that overwhelm our sense of individual events. So that's a little bit about what we're looking at. So my main point here is, I'm going to make this lecture another short one. I want you to investigate. I want you to spend more time listening to this music and thinking about it and comparing it. Again, recognizing that this is just an introduction. A, B, this isn't a numbered list. B, but anyway, B. Each of these composers has very different methods and techniques at arriving at sound mass. And C, that I lost track of the other ones, but that sound mass is not a very scientific description. You know, I mean, the best, probably maybe the best description I can come up with is the one that I included on your worksheet, Stockhausen. Here, I'll read from it. When we cannot count the individual notes in a group anymore, they surpass the group. With 7, the mass begins. This depends on the speed. Naturally, when the pace is too fast, we can't count them anymore, and 13 notes may just appear like a gesture. One doesn't feel like counting them. Or there are too many events all happening at once, like a swarm of bees. When you perceive the swarm as a shape, it becomes a single entity. If we see a tree, we don't count the leaves, but are still able to tell a pine tree from a beech. I think it's interesting when he talks about the swarm of bees, because initially we're thinking of the sound of a swarm of bees, which is a unique sound, a buzzing, gradually or sort of evolving texture. But then he talks about it as the shape, as a visual experience, which is also really interesting. A swarm of bees, or even of birds that kind of morphs, or a school of fish, you know. Anyway, so that's what we're talking about when we're talking about sound masses. You'll find lots of examples in all different kinds of music, but you know, again, we're specifically, because we focus a little bit on Euro-American classical music, we have focused on pieces that are in this category. I think I mentioned to you right at the beginning of the semester that anything we study in Music 296 had its precursor in the music of Charles Ives, and that's also the case with sound mass. I think the last movement of his Fourth Symphony, several layers of activity going on simultaneously, multiple conductors. There's a piece where I think we're definitely looking at sound mass achieved by a very different means than any of the other composers we've looked at. But again, that's another characteristic of this sort of paradigm, is that there are lots of different methods of arriving at it. I will mention one more composer, and I'm going to put an example below. Morton Feldman, who, of course, I showed you how his graph paper pieces were used to create pointillism. They were also used to create sound mass, and that the first intersection for orchestra, which was only recorded fairly recently. It was one of his first pieces he ever wrote, I think 1951. It's a pure sound mass piece, because he's taking this principle of giving high, medium, and low registers to an entire, you know, all the violins and violas, for instance, I believe. So you're gonna, in an orchestra, you're gonna have a bunch of people playing in their upper register. Well, there's a sound mass right there, and then he layers these different parts of the texture. Really cool piece. So I will include a score and a recording of that intersection below. Anyway, well, good luck. We will be in touch about your test and your final composition. And thank you again for your wonderful work and attention to these fun and important matters. Music is important. It's important to our survival and happiness as a species. Don't let anybody ever tell you otherwise. What you're doing is just as important as what anybody else is doing in our society, and giving people taking care of the spiritual needs and development of humanity. What could be more important? Spiritual, aesthetic, I think it's all part of the same thing. Anyway, bye.